Another dimension of the US-Venezuela story is energy. Venezuela sits on some of the world's largest oil reserves, and U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are uniquely positioned to handle heavy crude like Venezuela's. While Florida is not a massive refining hub, its proximity to Gulf Coast refineries means it stands to benefit if more Venezuelan crude enters the U.S. supply chain. Challenges still exist since Venezuela's outdated oil infrastructure has been on a steady decline since the 1970s when it was at its peak of production. To break that down for us, we are joined via Zoom by Dr. Edward Glab, an energy policy expert at Florida International University, to talk about what this means for Florida's energy sector and beyond. Thank you, Dr. Glab, for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
I'd like to start by asking you, how is it that the energy policy of the United States in Latin America, Venezuela in particular, how has that impacted the local economy of South Florida, West Central Florida, and how could that be impacted again depending on developments in Venezuela after the action of January the 3rd?
Well, that's a very good question because historically the oil business has been very, very good for South Florida. Historically, Venezuela, both Venezuela and Peru have been very important oil production centers, and the home offices for both IPC, the International Petroleum Company, which was a subsidiary of Exxon's Canadian affiliate, Imperial Oil, as well as Exxon's office is in Coral Gables, produce thousands, literally thousands of jobs. Just to give you an example, when I first got to Miami, when I was assigned to Miami with Exxon, we had about 500 or 600 employees in Coral Gables. Now, those were direct employees. If you crank in the indirect employees and the impact on the economy in terms of housing and restaurants and schools and all the rest, it played a very significant role because those were the days when Venezuela was producing 3 to 4 million barrels of oil a day. Most of that was going to the Gulf Coast refineries because, as you quite correctly point out, 40% of the American refining capacity is along the Gulf Coast, and those refineries were designed specifically to process heavy crude oil, the type that Venezuela produces. The other factor that influenced Miami, believe it or not, was a refinery that Exxon had in Aruba. It used to produce up to 500,000 barrels a day of oil. That is amazingly significant because it produced huge numbers of jobs in Aruba, but also a support team in Miami. So historically, and I'll tell you just a couple of quick anecdotes to try and get the people to understand how significant a role it's played in the economy. I had friends back in those days in the 70s when I was working with Venezuela from Texas, but also in the 80s when I lived in Miami. And people would fly in from Caracas for a long weekend and spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in the shops along Miracle Mile. I had a couple of friends who had businesses, small businesses there. So, when you think about that in terms of the impact that all of that money being generated in Venezuela and so much of it being spent in the United States, and in particular in South Florida, had a very significant impact. Now, all of that has pretty much gone away. My last assignment in South Florida was help the company to close down our operations. And so basically when I got back, my last assignment here was in the year 2000. And over the next 3 or 4 years, we pretty much eliminated 800 positions. Now, that had a huge impact on South Florida.
So you've mentioned the infrastructure when you were working in Venezuela. You've mentioned the infrastructure. Describe that infrastructure that you witnessed in the oil production and what it looks like today.
Well, I haven't been there recently, so I can't tell you what it looks like today. But I do have friends. I have friends from Chevron And I've talked to them about this, and I've talked to other people who are more familiar with that infrastructure than I am. And it's a shambles. It's an absolute shambles.
Mm.
But let me tell you what the worst thing is. It's not so much the pipes and the refineries and the pumps, it's the technology. Venezuela is way behind in technology and the people who've been studying it and developing software. And I'll tell you why this is so important. When I was with Exxon, we employed more PhDs in research and engineering,
Mm.
both theoretical as well as implied, than Harvard or MIT combined. So if you want to be an oil producer, you have to stay abreast of the technology. That's number one. Number two is what is perhaps even more important as the pipes is the reservoir and
Mhm.
managing the reservoir of oil in the ground correctly. Because if you don't, and you have a field where you can produce 10,000 barrels and you mismanage it over the years, you may only get 1,000 barrels out of it. So we don't know at this point how badly the reservoirs have been managed in Venezuela. But I can tell you something absolutely definitely. If they have not been bringing in technology from the big companies like ExxonMobil and BP and
Mhm.
Shell, and Chevron, they are decades behind in that right now. And that's going to be a huge challenge. In Venezuela, there's no possibility of Venezuela getting anywhere near its former peak production for at least a decade or more, and an investment of billions and billions of dollars.
Based on your experience, what would you say are the key factors, though, that would determine success or failure in redeveloping that oil industry in Venezuela?
You have to get the private oil sector involved. Nobody else has the money for this. Uh, Here's the way they do this analysis. Political risk and hurdle rates was one of my specialties. I did this all over the world. I didn't do it just in Latin America or Venezuela. If I'm sitting in the corporate headquarters of any of these big oil companies, I'm going to say to myself, what is the risk and what is the potential return? Is the juice worth the squeeze? How much of a risk am I going to have to take for my reward? And the squeeze is how many billions of dollars, how many highly educated engineers, how much technology am I going to have to pour into Venezuela before I can even think about maybe
Mm-hmm.
getting a return? Now, in a country like Venezuela, that hurdle rate would be up near the clouds because the risk is still huge in Venezuela. They cut off one head of the nine-headed Hydra that manages Venezuela. That's from Greek mythology. You know, the poisonous snake, it had
Yes, yes.
10 heads. If you cut off one, two more grew back in its place.
Mm-hmm.
When they cut off one head, every single other poisonous snake running Venezuela is still there. Now, as a political risk analyst, I'd be advising my company to, whoa, take a step back and think twice about this. Do I want to put billions more in a country that has already screwed me out of billions?
Mm-hmm.
Remember, Venezuela still owes billions of dollars to ConocoPhillips. They owe billions of dollars to Exxon. So do you want to pour good money after bad into a country like Venezuela? I can't speak for those companies, but I know what my advice would be to them.
And critics of the action in Venezuela, who are hearing the sound bites from the president and from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, say that we are going to rebuild the oil industry in Venezuela and it will benefit the people of Venezuela as well as Americans. These critics are saying that they are very concerned about large energy companies benefiting from policy shifts at the detriment of others, of our partners. How do you see all that? How should viewers understand the relationship that's there?
You know, I understand people have historically been very suspicious of oil companies and how they operate, but I don't see at this point how any oil company, unless Venezuela paid off those debts that they owe to the private sector, are going to benefit in any way from the current policy. You've heard both the Secretary of State as well as the President say, oh, we're going to get 30 million barrels, or we're going to get 50 million barrels. That's a drop in the bucket. The daily production of oil in the world consumption is 100 million barrels. So that, and you look at production right now in Venezuela, that's 900,000 barrels a day. Well, that's less than 1% of total global consumption production right now. And there is huge surplus capacity. Surplus capacity means if the US could turn up its production, which it could, Saudi Arabia could turn up its production, Russia could increase its production. So, in reality, driving the price of oil down is going to discourage investment in Venezuela. If,
As you look at this map, would you say that Florida has a direct role in the ports, the fuel supply, the pricing, in the refining of Venezuelan oil when it comes to these different layers?
No, Florida has no direct role in that, other than the fact that the Secretary of State's from Florida, and so he's playing an important role. I don't see what role the courts are going to be playing right now in Venezuela, other than the issues revolving around the money Venezuela owes the private sector, and I don't know where Venezuela could possibly get that money from. The situation as it stands right now is, I think we've gotten ourselves into a quagmire at the moment in Venezuela. We're spending a lot of money. Those military forces that are going there don't come for free. And we still have the same narco, military, corrupt officials running the country, and they're going to be running it for the foreseeable future. So, frankly, I don't have any answers for this. But I know we're in a deep ditch right now, and I certainly wish well the United States foreign policy makers digging us out of this.
Well, we do want to ask you one quick question before we go. It's a question that so many people are asking, and it is realistically, how long, from your expertise, will it take Venezuelan oil production to increase in a way that's significant, that's meaningful?
Decades.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's fascinating to get your take. And also, go Florida International University, my alma mater.
All right, I'm with you on that one.
Thank you. Again, that was Dr. Edward Glab, the co-director of the Global Energy Security Forum at the School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University.